Welcome everyone, Byron White here. I hope you can hear me. If you can't really do much because you can't hear me, but if you can hear me and you can't hear me that well, please leave a note in the questions section. That's also an area where you're going to be able to post lots of things, but I'm here with Samantha Stone. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here on this snowy day.
Indeed. We're both here on a snowy day, the blizzard as it sort of turns out to be. We were talking a little bit before today's webinar about Samantha's work at the Weather channel, which is owned by the Weather Company. And we're happy to report that even though it may be not quite the blizzard that we thought it might be, there is not false advertising going on, at least with Samantha's client, the Weather Company. So thanks for that, Samantha. Samantha is the author of Unleash Possible, the marketing playbook that drives sales. And I'm super excited to announce that she's also one of our speakers at Content Marketing Conference, which we're gearing up towards in a big way. Samantha, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm actually really excited to be talking about editorial calendars and using buy-in insights to help us improve the impact of the content that we create.
Let me walk through a brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn things over to you. But let's most importantly get to how much accumulation do you have outside your window there? Let's get to the fundamentals.
The really important stuff. It's looking about 3.5 inches right now, which means I don't have to shovel because I have sort of a 6-inch rule. If it's less than 6 inches, I send my teenagers out without me. If it's more, I feel guilty and I help them.
Here's the interesting part of that question. In about an hour from now, I'm going to ask you that question again, so try to keep track. The heavy stuff is starting to come down now, so it'll be interesting to get an update from you. Let's go through a couple of quick slides. For starters, this webinar is being recorded. I guarantee you someone will ask me that question. It has happened consistently for almost 85 questions. Someone comes in midway through or has to leave for a few minutes and comes back. Is this being recorded? So yes, it is being recorded, and we're going to send everyone the link. I'd like you to use the question tab over in your GoToWebinar control panel, nerve center, if you will, to fire me questions throughout the presentation. I'm going to make notes on all of them and walk through them at the end. Please, please, please send your questions. It will make things much more lively and interesting. If you want to learn some insights, count on other people having the same quest for knowledge that you have, so please help us there. Sharing the love on this snowy day would be nice, and so right on is the hashtag to use there. Send your love to either Samantha or myself as well. We'll take it. Thank you for that. So everybody knows a little bit enough about me, so I'll move right along, but I will say that we're gearing up for what could be an epic content marketing conference this year. We really have gone all out this year. The migration and move from Vegas to Boston has proved to be very exciting and interesting. We're going to feature some a nationally known comedian to follow up one of our days. We have Brian Halligan, the CEO of HubSpot, joining me for a fireside chat one day. We have 11 keynotes this year, 30 sessions, 6 workshops, and we're pleased to announce something very different. We're going to launch on Friday a content marketing workshop, a comedy marketing workshop, excuse me. Which is going to be very exciting, and we're going to try to have some fun with the importance of comedy and how we need more of it in our marketing to make it engaging and interesting. So we're going to have a whole workshop which will be available for free for anybody that signs up for a ticket with for Content Marketing Conference. I need to get my CMCs correct. I'm not used to it yet. Samantha is she's going to tell us a little bit about herself, but she is best described perhaps as a B2B marketing junkie, a writer, a speaker, a consultant, a personal coach, and a lot of fun over the phone, which I have had the pleasure of engaging her and interacting with her. She's a lot of fun, and I really enjoy spending any and all time with her that I can. She's from Boston as well, and we just must get together more, Samantha. I really mean that. So that'll be fun to hear a little bit about her background. She's doing some really great work as the founder of the Marketing Advisory Network, and she'll tell you a little bit about that. But the session today is one that's near and dear to my heart, partly because I just wrote a book on content strategy that's going to be released in the next few weeks. And I'm very excited to learn from her about how we can dive into topics that our customers are interested and engaged in and what's a better way to do that. So I personally will have lots of questions for Samantha at the end of her session today. But without further ado, big happiness for everyone on board. You can get a 15% discount for CMC in Boston on April 11th now through the 14th by using the code CMC17webinar, and we'll hopefully see you in Boston. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to you, Samantha Kerplunk. Let me find you. Hang on one sec. Here we go. Kerplunk. There you go. Take it away.
Look at that. I feel all sharing going on now. So hopefully everyone can now share my screen. Thank you for having me here, Byron. And all you have to do is say hot chocolate, and I'm at your offices anytime. So I look forward to getting together in person when the snowstorm goes away. So I do want to thank everyone for joining me today talking about buyer insights and improving our editorial calendar. We've got lots and lots of tips to share with you. Byron did a great job of introducing me and told you all about my professional credentials, so I won't bore you by repeating that. I will let you know that I am a mother of 4 boys, so there is absolutely no question or comment that you can make that will offend me in any way. I have heard, seen, and smelled everything that you can imagine, and so I am very glad that you joined me, and we'll dive into some really fun and important discussions today.
Samantha, have a look at your screen for one sec. I see a gray screen. Now that might be the weather outside that you're pointing at, but I'm not quite sure. Have a look, and we want to make sure we're looking at your screens.
So you can't see my agenda slide?
Kelly, how about you? Can you see Amanda's slide? It might just be me, but...
Hi. I am all good. I can see her slides.
You can. All right. Ignore me for a second. I'll figure out what's wrong with my system.
Yeah, no worries, Byron. I did turn everything else off, so I should be
Okay.
good to go. But if anything, Kelly, if you start to have any concerns from audience members, please don't hesitate to shout out at me, and we'll get it fixed. So I do want to just set some context for what we're going to talk about today. As we all are busy content marketers, you know, our editorial calendars are our lifeline. They keep us organized, and they keep us focused on our delivery schedule. But I like to think of our editorial calendar as actually something much more than a time management tool. It actually can, when appropriately researched, become our audience guidepost. So today we're going to talk about 3 sources of buyer insights that, you know, candidly we underutilize in most organizations, but when we use them, they can be incredibly helpful at making us more efficient. We're going to talk about where to look for topic inspiration. This is something that I know many of us are challenged with as we, especially as our efforts mature and a lot of the obvious topics are covered. We need to find new and interesting ways to address the things that are important to our buyers, and so we'll talk about how to do that. We'll talk about simple, and I mean simple, qualitative research techniques that will help us improve the resonance of the content that we create. And we'll talk about how to leverage interviews specifically to prioritize content for our audience. So we've got a lot of good stuff that we'll go over together. So I want to dive in, and I want to make sure to have a little bit of context about the challenge that editorial calendars can help us resolve and the context by which we have to make these decisions. And I want to start by talking about what is a content marketer's job. So we all have a formal title, and it could be any iteration and lots of variation and do that. But there are several synonyms that actually describe what we do, I think, much better than content marketer overall. So in addition to being writers and editors and community advocates, we're jugglers. We juggle deadlines, authors, white papers, blog posts. We even juggle a lot of egos, right? For example, I was talking to a client, and they told me that they had 7 different content formats and 61 different content deliverables that was on their current calendar. We were checking in last week. That was only for the next 90 days. right? And they're not unusual. Our calendars may or may not be exactly as complex as that, but we have lots and lots of things that we're juggling. We're also brand ambassadors. We have deep passion for our community. It's why we got into our work in the first place. But underlying all of what we really do, we also have to be very good at helping people who are creating content on our behalf and on behalf of our brand to understand how to represent our value propositions and our brand with consistency. And my least favorite, but perhaps the most accurate, is we are chief nag officers, right? We don't want to bag our colleagues. Nobody grows up and says, I want to be that annoying person that's constantly hounding people to meet their deadlines. But the reality is very little that needs to happen happens without some coaxing. And in some cases, a lot of coaxing. One of the content marketers that I talked with told me that somewhere between 75 and 80% of her day was spent reminding people what needed to get done. Not actually doing the work, reminding people about the work that needs to get done. She holds too many meetings to count, sends an unbelievable amount of emails, and with what is very little left of her day, she does do some writing and some content creation. She has quite literally no time to do any analysis. And so she falls into what's a very common trap, which is measuring the effectiveness on their content marketing efforts by how much content is being produced. But the reality is she doesn't really know if she's creating the right kind of content. Unfortunately, that particular content marketer is really not alone. And it's not a wonder, because when we first started doing content marketing, it was relatively easy. As a discipline, we were starting from zero, and so everything that we did made a difference. But as we've scaled our commitment to content marketing and as we've understood its value, all those ad hoc processes that we built, they're actually holding us hostage to checklists and long to-do lists instead of what we need to be focusing on, which is making a big impact. We can see that where this happens really easily when we look at the content creation process, for example. So step one, we assign an author. This is assuming we have a subject matter expert on hand who can help us, or at least a colleague whose arm we can twist, right? Then we have to notify the author about the topic we want them to write about. We probably give them some guidelines, certainly around the due date. We might tell them a little bit about the target audience. And we may have some other guidance like target word count or where this content is going to be used. And because we know that this isn't the only thing on that author's to-do list, we send them a reminder as that due date approaches. And not to our surprise, the due date usually passes and we don't have a copy of the content, right? Because the reality is whatever it was that that person was doing for us, they have gotten distracted about some other business priority. And we're sending more emails and reminding people more about things. And at this point, that author is feeling rather guilty and tries to avoid eye contact with us at any point that they can. Eventually, that guilt plays off, and we receive a copy of the draft content. And now, our complex process and ad hoc processes continue because we need to take that content and we need to have people review it. And we have this internal review committee. Now, as much as we create a Google Doc or some other shared repository where you put this information and you ask people to provide their feedback, someone sends you their feedback in email, someone walks down to your desk and verbally tells you this, and now you have to reconcile that with all the other feedback that you got. Eventually, you get to a place where this content is ready to be published. And so you do all the things that have to happen to get it into a publishing standpoint. And if it's a blog post, that's a relatively easy process. If it's something more complex, it takes more time. And if we're having a good day, remember to set a link to that content to the author who helped us create it so they can bask in the glory of being published. And hopefully, the next time we need to twist their arm again, they're willing to do so. That process is long and tedious, and frankly, it's boring. It adds very little value except that it keeps things moving forward. And what I described to you doesn't even take into account really the design and making the content visually appealing, and it doesn't take into account any promotion for getting the audience in front of our content. Now, When we first started our content marketing efforts, that wasn't so bad because we were doing it for a very small set of content. But as we've scaled our content efforts and as we've added more authors, it becomes more and more complex. This exact problem happened to a client of mine. They had one full-time content marketing person, and they were sort of pretending to be a full-time content marketing person because they also were responsible for the website and they helped with some executive presentations. They even addressed some sales calls. But they also wrote 3 to 4 blog posts a month, and they produced a white paper every quarter, and they did 2 or 3 web seminars. They were really busy, but it was completely manageable. And then we did 3 things. We introduced a video blog series, we introduced a guest blogger program, and we challenged every part of their company to submit blog content at least once a quarter. Suddenly, we had a lot of great content, and it was actually very interesting content, but we had created a bottleneck. We created an editing bottleneck, and so pretty soon, most of the content that was being created wasn't being shared, it wasn't being promoted. Everyone was getting really, really frustrated with the process. So we entered the spreadsheet. You know, the one, every content marketer has one of some format. It's where we're desperately trying to hold on to our sanity. It's ugly, it's difficult to read, and candidly, no one but you ever remembers to edit it, no matter how many times we ask people to contribute directly to it. We have links that go to shared documents, we have due dates, we have statuses, we have so much that we are chasing. The result are these processes that are holding us back from actually impacting the business because all we're doing is running around trying to get things done. But we have to pause. We have to make time to make sure what we are producing is driving impact for our audience. So how are we going to do that when we're so busy chasing everything going around? And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that we need to do to try and make that time, that we make sure that the content we're creating is the right content. And a lot of what we do is sort of unfortunate and often sad attempts to reach out to our organization and to ask them for ideas and inspiration and help. I don't know if you recognize this picture. This is a shot from one of my all-time favorite movies, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I'm not quite sure why that movie resonates so much with me, but I just adore it. I can watch it over and over again. And there's a scene in this movie where this teacher is standing in front of the audience and they are droning on and on about some very boring topic. And at one point, he asks his students a question, and there's complete silence. And he says, anyone? Anyone? It's really monotone. And again, complete silence. Nothing's coming back. It's like the silent echo chamber where we're out there and we're trying to make resonance and we're trying to get ideas. And a client of mine struggled through this recently, actually, and she was sort of stuck in this echo chamber herself, and she was really frustrated. And so she asked me, you know, I'm out of ideas, and I'm struggling to get feedback, and I need help. So I asked her what she had done to collect ideas for the editorial calendar, because she had actually spent 2 years doing incredible work. She was working really hard. She'd cranked through tons of incredibly impressive pieces of content. They were making a big difference on the business and on her audience, and she was building quite a reputation with the people they were hoping to build that relationships with. But she was burned out. She had sort of out of fresh ideas, and she needed that inspiration to come from other places. So she told me that she sent out a survey to the entire company soliciting ideas that they might be able to use. And this sounds like a reasonable thing to do. She put together a profile of the audience they were serving. She even provided a little bit of a summary of what kinds of content they had produced in the past and the response that she had gotten. And she was smart, and she threw out some fun prizes. And the reality is she got a ton of responses. The problem was she got almost no useful responses. In fact, what she got back was mostly variations on content she had already produced. Not only did she fail to capture new ideas, but now this poor woman was actually kind of depressed because it was pretty clear people didn't realize what had already been produced. The people on her team were not spending time reading all this phenomenal work that she had created over the last 2 years. And so she decided she was going to switch gears, and she was going to hold a smaller brainstorm meeting with a group of people that she hand-selected. And this is something most of us do, and if we're lucky, we do these kinds of brainstorm meetings with some regular cadence. And we go into them very hopeful that we're bound to have some great ideas, right? You're all getting together, you're talking about it, some things are going to happen. And we're sort of partially right. We always walk out with a longer to-do list. That spreadsheet has more lines on it than we had in the past. But are we creating a calendar around the right kind of content? In that meeting, she didn't have data displayed about how their audience by role had engaged with content they had produced in the past. She did have a list of what they'd produced, but not how the audience by role had interacted with it. She didn't have trending data on what is being shared and talk about in their key topic areas outside the organization. And they hadn't recently interviewed buyers to solicit direct feedback on their editorial calendar. When we're already working so hard, it's easy to forget that we need to take that pause and we need to do the homework to make sure that we are getting the insight we need to not just create more content, but to create the right content. And I recognize fully that it's really hard to imagine doing this when there's so much to do. And what I'm going to tell you is I want you to do less. I want you to do less things, but I want you to do more things that have a higher impact. So we are going to find ways to make time by taking that step back. And I'm going to talk to you now about the 3 places that I go on a regular basis for content inspiration that I have found incredibly valuable and critical to success. First, I want us to talk about leveraging all the data you can possibly get your hands on. Data analysis goes beyond what people have viewed in the past, and we start to really look at what they've engaged with, what's converted, how has it impacted our business. Analytics helps us find incredibly important insights. A company that I know recently found a hidden, unknown influencer in their buying process using content analytics to look at these kinds of things. They knew that they sold to chief operating officers within a very specific set of industries and certain types of organizations, and that chief operating officer really was their primary buyer. They made the decision about what to purchase. What they didn't realize before they'd done the analytics, that there was a really critical link between the chief operating officer and the vendors that that person spoke with. It was basically a research-based administrator that reported directly to the chief operating officer that was pulling together the list of vendors that that chief operating officer would communicate with and doing all the background research for him, or her in some cases, but mostly hims in their industry, so that that chief operating officer could have productive conversations and knew who to focus on. That person was super behind the scenes, and if they hadn't done the analysis to see these spikes in content consumption, they wouldn't have learned about the important role this person played. And by understanding the role this person played, it changed some of their editorial calendar because they realized they had been writing all this content for a chief operating officer to consume. But what they hadn't done and packaged it in a way that someone who was not the chief operating officer could easily summarize it and understand the key points and report it back up to someone. So they knew now that they had this person that they needed to serve and be able to do. The other thing that they learned was that they now could track and see spikes in activity for this research-based administrative role, and they could trigger sales activity based on when they saw these spikes. Now remember, this is a person that they completely dismissed prior in all of their content planning, but the data analysis uncovered some interesting things they needed to act on. And that data is incredibly insightful. But for most of us, our content dashboard would never expose that kind of insights. For most of us, our dashboards look something like you now see on your screen. We list a series of content that's published. For this purposes, there's only a small number of things, but we know those lists are much, much, much longer, which only make trying to make sense of it even more confusing. We look at things like how much of that content's been viewed, shared. Perhaps we're tracking how much of that has been commented upon. But there's no impact in the buyer's journey reflected here, and there's no breakdown of this by the role or the specific audiences that I'm reaching out to. If you look at the last item on this list, the RFP template, and you go just by what you see on here, you would see that this content is underconsumed. And I apologize, there is a typo on the date there. That should be November 16, not November 17, which has not yet happened. So we're not seeing the future here. But if we actually were to look at this content and you would go just based on this, I would not create more content. I would not add things to my editorial calendar that built on this RFP template. It would make me think that it's an underperforming asset. Yet what we really need is a dashboard that looks more like this, where I am tracking the impact of the content I'm creating on my business, but also I'm breaking down certain data points by the audiences that I'm serving. In fact, if I had ignored the RFP template based on the dashboard I saw sooner, it would have been a huge mistake, because I would have no way of knowing before this new report that in fact that RFP template was only viewed by 10 people, but it in fact influenced 6 opportunities and drove a lot of revenue. Whereas I look at something like the trends landscape report that I now see, and 1,000 people looked at that. That's a lot of people, but it had 0 impact on opportunities and revenue. Now, I'm not suggesting that the trend landscape report doesn't have a role or that it is more or less important than the RFP template. But what I am suggesting is we need to do data to understand how different pieces of content are influencing our audiences in different places and how they engage with us. And we need reporting analysis that breaks down our metrics by audience and impact of our business so we can make smart, informed decisions about what gets put on our editorial calendar. Now, I don't want you to worry if you don't have an analytics infrastructure to do that kind of analysis yet, because there are lots of different ways that you can get inspiration and insights that does not involve a deep analysis of data that may exist within your systems. But I do encourage you to make sure that if you don't have a system that can do that, that you explore the opportunity of building one. So let's do a little detective work. I want us to turn into our Nancy Drews and into our Sherlock Holmes and explore what tools are out there that can help inspire us without digging into our own data. And I also want you to keep in mind, even if you do dig into your own data, you also want to leverage tools like these as well. One of the common tools that people use are called topic generators. And if you go into Google or whatever your search engine of choice is and you try and search for topic generators, you're going to see a ton of different things that are going to pop up. On the screen here, you'll see an example from HubSpot, and you'll see one from Portent. HubSpot presents a list. Portent sort of helps you visualize in a thought stream some ideas. You go into a search box, you put in a topic, you'll see there in the HubSpot example, and Portent I used editorial calendar, and it'll pop up different types of topics that you can use. And this can be helpful to overcome writer's block. And that's a useful exercise. However, the tools are flawed because they don't actually look at how my audience is asking questions or what my audience is telling me that they already liked and shared. It's just using common algorithms to come up with playful ways of looking at a topic and adding things very sort of list-oriented. So it has a role. It's not a bad thing, but it's not going to provide you the type of audience insights that's going to be helpful to drive new editorial content thinking. Use this more to come up with titles for things that you might be struggling with. You'll see another example here on the bottom, blog post ideas generator. That's even a more challenging and flawed model because I come in there and I don't even put a custom topic in. It just tells me in general what a blog might want to write about. So I want to spend our time exploring other tools that do a better job of helping us dive into real audience insights. Wouldn't it be great if we could get a list of questions our audience is asking about the problems or opportunities that we address for them? Right? That's sort of nirvana. I want to know what they want, and then I want to deliver that content to them. Quora is an example of a tool that does exactly this. It delivers a list of questions people are really asking about a particular content in a particular topic. Here you'll see I typed in topics around editorial calendars, and it pops up lists of questions that people have asked in Quora specifically about that. When we use Quora or any of the other query tools that do similar types of things, I want you to go beyond just your editorial keyword. I could have just used the words editorial calendar. But when I add context around it, I actually get a different set of questions. So you'll see two examples here. I said, what editorial calendars don't suck? And I said, editorial calendar challenges. Both sort of getting at the pain of editorial calendars, but the questions that came out of it actually were somewhat different. There was some overlap, but there were new ones as well. So we want to make sure that when we run our own types of queries using tools like this, that we use a variety of those keywords and we base it on them. Answer the Public is similar to Quora in that you put topics in and it generates a list of questions. In this case, they visualize it. You'll see in the upper right-hand corner there sort of a visual web of those questions, but it's doing effectively the same thing. In this case, it actually gives me a set of countries that I can choose from, and while it doesn't have country representation for every country in the world, it does have a good selection of countries that I can choose from. And this allows me to find geographic nuance. So if I'm writing content and responsible for content both in Europe as well as in the US, it's really interesting to see what questions arise in one region versus the other. If you do use Answer the Public, give it a few seconds to run. The first time I used the tools, I put a query in and I thought it was going nowhere and something was broken, but once I waited a few seconds, actually about a minute, it actually gave me query results. So there isn't really an indicator necessarily that pops up right away that it's running, so just have a little bit of patience and know that it is doing its work. Another tool is the Social Animal, and this is a tool, it actually does not display questions that our audience has asked, like the tools that I was just showing you. But it does show you all the content related to the keywords that you put in there that has been published across a number of different kinds of social channels and across the web. And it shows you how much that has been shared and where it has been shared. And so you can see things that are very popular, and that could be a really interesting signal for us. And I can select whether I want to look at this, what's popular in the last year, or the last 3 months, maybe even the last 24 hours. They give you a lot of selections there. So that's another way of getting inspiration to think about what are people writing about and what are they sharing, so I can take a twist on that and make it my own. You may also want to use that content to be commentary. Look at an article that was the most popular, link to that article, and add your own perspective about why that matters, whether you agree or disagree with it. They do have a tab in their tool called Inspire Me, which you can see on the left-hand portion of the screen, but I will let you know that that visualization is kind of a good idea, but I actually find it a little bit difficult to use. It's not my favorite form of visualizing that information. So in terms of sort of that inspiration, I prefer to use some of those other questioning tools. Picshins is also another tool, and they do some of the same things that Social Animal does and others. But one of the reasons I wanted to pull out a screenshot from them is that we don't always only want to know the topics that are covered. We also want to understand the format that content is being delivered in, because we know that our audience learns in different ways. And so some people are very visual learners, some are more auditory learners, some like infographics, some like white papers, some like webinars like we're on right now. And so I can use keywords to search for content over different periods of time and see what type of content has been produced. I did a search here for editorial calendar around infographics, and you can see there's almost no infographics that have been produced in the time period for which I did the search. This is a BIS that I might want to fill. And so it could be a really useful way to think about how we not only come up with unique topics, but we come up with formats that other people aren't covering well. This next tool is BuzzSumo, and it's a tool you might be familiar with. It's probably the most popular of the tools that people subscribe to get this kind of content inspiration. And it's a great resource. It covers trending topics and content types and some of the other things that I've talked there. It's a little bit slicker visual orientation than Social Animal, which is one of the tools that I showed you. But even here, we want to remember as we use tools like this to make sure that we're thinking about the relevant time periods for our keywords. You'll see there in the screen that I did a search for editorial calendar and I looked at the past week and nothing popped up. But when I redid that search for content over the past year, a lot of really interesting things arose for me to be cued off of. So make sure when you're using tools like this that you're looking over time periods that are going to be relevant for your audience and for the topics that you're discussing. In addition to insights and content format and also popular content, some of the other tools, including BuzzSumo, help you look at influencers. And one of the things that's very interesting about looking at influencers is that it can actually inspire editorial calendar in two really interesting ways. The first is you should go and read what those people are writing, right? Because you might find a topic that's particularly complex or that influencer has an unusual position. And if you do, you should ask them to do a Q&A. You should interview them and talk to them about the article that they wrote. Often that's a much easier way of adding something to the editorial calendar than trying to reach out to them generically or trying to pay them to create content for you. But if you want to sort of act as a publishing medium to comment on something they've already written, you'll find people very receptive. Second, you can use this tool to identify rising stars, people who have some influence and are writing on the topics you care about, but perhaps don't have as big a following or as big a name as the top influencers. They may be more likely to do a guest blog post for you if you approach them. So these are great ways to use these tools to inspire content that's relevant for your audience. And you know this because you're searching for content that you know is appealing. Now, I want to switch gears to our third form. We've talked about data analytics and we've talked about tools that can inspire us by showing us what our audience already cares about, what they're asking about, what they're sharing, and where they're getting inspiration, and how those tools can help us find gaps where there isn't good coverage today. I want to talk now about real people that can inspire great content creation. And I want you to become insatiably curious in every conversation you have. Asking questions of our audience is not just the domain of product marketing or sales. Sometimes we as content marketers are not assertive enough about having conversations directly with the audience that we're serving. And I want us to change that. I want us to dig deeply. If you look at the picture in front of you right now, it looks like a picture of sand. And every grain of sand in this picture looks virtually the same. It's tan. I can't tell one piece of sand from another, right? It all looks identical. However, if you take those same grains of sand and I put them under a microscope, what you see is actually very unique perspective. Each grain of sand looks very different and looks very unique. And so we want to make sure that we add a qualitative process to what we're doing to not only look at data, to not only look at some of these topic trends, but to talk to the people that we're creating content for, because they can help us magnify unique perspectives and differentiators that we can't get in any other way. But I also know this can be incredibly time-consuming, and it can be a little nerve-wracking and overwhelming for someone who hasn't done a lot of qualitative research in the past. So I'm going to share some very simple things that you can do that make a very big impact. First, I want to talk about and remind us that we are creating content for real people, you know that, but we're not creating content for ourselves. We're creating content for our audience. And so it's really important when we're building this editorial calendar that we put aside for the moment our goal of selling things and we focus on what's valuable to our readers. And one of the ways that we could do this is to map out the buyer's journey that those audience members go through, but not from our perspective, not from a salesperson's perspective to understand what do we need in terms of a proposal or negotiation. What questions does our audience have at each stage of this process that we can answer? And we need to resist the temptation to treat everyone the same and instead make sure we're creating content that we can serve to this audience. Now, you're going to have a very, very long list of questions potentially that people want to ask at various stages. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed by thinking I need to do every single thing right now. I would rather you pick one or two really critical questions that no one else does a good job of answering and make that your focus initially and build up over time. On this slide, you see this gentleman who's in a tie. His name is Oliver. This is actually a persona for a client of mine. And Oliver initiates projects that this company sells that's related to their business. But what you see here is that when it comes to vendor comparisons, Oliver actually has very few questions because he's not very involved. He delegates that task. The client that I've been working with was making a mistake because Oliver was so critical to not only triggering a project, but ultimately making the financial decision and moving forward. They were pummeling Oliver with all different kinds of content about the vendor comparisons. And in fact, it turned out they were turning off Oliver because he had delegated those tasks to his team. He was very busy and he really wanted his team to be responsible for doing that. So instead of all the content that had been geared to Oliver in the vendor comparison category, they moved that content to the people who were actually appropriate for answering those questions. And by taking the time to math this out, our audience segmentation and our content mapping becomes much, much more natural. So how do we sort of learn that? Well, some of that we learn by doing persona research. We talk to our sales teams. But even without the complexity of doing full modeling and audience acquisitions, we can start to get insights into the content that our audience will think is important simply by showing them a list of topics that we are considering creating content around. We can show them pieces of our editorial content and we just ask them. Every time I talk to a potential buyer, whether it's because I'm doing persona research or I'm interviewing them for a case study or I'm just catching up with them over coffee at a conference, I always have this list of topics handy with me in my back pocket. Sometimes it's a list of 3 or 4 things, sometimes it's a longer list. And I sneak in the question and I ask them, I want you to look at the titles of these headlines and based only on the headlines that I'm showing you, tell me how compelled you would be to read the article. And I asked them to do it on a 0 to 5 scale. 0, they're not interested at all. 5, they drop what they're doing to read it right now. And you'd be surprised how valuable that insight is. And it only takes 5 minutes, but it can be incredibly, incredibly helpful. I also want to make sure that you don't forget to ask that question as an open-ended question where you're not actually giving them the list of topics, but you ask them, so what else would you like to read that I didn't show you? And I'm going to be honest with you, 85% of the people who you're going to ask are going to have no suggestions. That's normal. Don't give up asking because the few people who have an idea, it's like gold. They're giving you this really important insight. This happened to me very recently. I had 40 interviews lined up to do a project that I was working on to build a content strategy. And about 10 interviews in, I realized, oh, I'm not getting where. The topics that I'm giving people, some of them are resonating, but it's a low hit rate. And I had asked every person leading up to this 10th interview, and what additional content would you like to read? And I wasn't getting anything. On this 10th interview, the person gave me 2 ideas. One was a twist on the topic I already given them, and another was a totally different idea. I took the twist and the new idea, and for the balance of the 30 interviews that I still had left to do, I presented it. And you know what? Those 2 things are what resonated most with everyone. So don't give up. Keep asking those questions because you'll be shocked about what great information comes. Now, the very last tip that I want to give you is the most overlooked, but it is actually the simplest thing that we can execute against. And that is to get specific feedback on content assets by asking the intended reader to actually preview them before publication. Every one of you on the phone, including myself, has some type of editorial review process that you go through internally. You have someone else who reads your content, does a proofread, approves and signs off on the content. And yet most of the time we never have an external reader who's actually the intended audience for our content in our review cycle. And it's so easy to do. You do not need large sample sizes for this. You ask 1 or 2 people and you'll be shocked by the insights that you gathered. Recently, I did a presentation for marketing profs and account-based marketing. And I wrote up all the content for it, and I was going to turn in some blog posts as well, and I knew this was going to be some meaningful content. So you don't need to do this exercise for everything that you produce, but for things that have meat and heft to them. And I went to a single marketing person that I know who was about to roll out an account-based marketing program. So I knew this was my intended audience. And I simply asked her to look at the content and answer 3 questions. 1, is the material...
I think we might have all lost sound on Samantha's last slide. Let's see if she comes back in a second. I'm going to help everyone by reading the last part of her last slide. I think it was a really good point she made there. It doesn't stop after the interviews. When you are writing a substantial piece of content, get feedback. I'll give you an example. She has to present on a account-based marketing program. The slides will be used during the presentation. Then I will use the content in blogs and elsewhere. Before finalizing my presentation, I send it to the marketer who knows a lot about the program, and I ask her 3 things. Is this material helpful to you?
Hi, Byron, can you hear me now?
Oh, I can hear you now.
So I apologize. My power went out and back on, and it just fluctuated enough to disconnect me. So my deepest apologies to all of you on the phone. The good news is that was my last slide, except for this summary. So are we okay? Maybe I can just do a quick summary and we can open up to questions?
Absolutely. And just so you know, you're the fastest guest to return to the webinar that I think I've ever seen ever, so thank you for that. I brought people through the 3 things to ask, and I was just on the second one, so once you pick up from there, I was trying to cover for you looking at your actual slides.
All I was doing was summarizing. These 3 things are really important. Make sure we do fewer things, but do more impactful things. So with that, I will open up to questions, and thank you for your patience as the storm plays havoc with our connection here.
No problem. Here's a question for you, and it's on my end. So we heard some fantastic topic research tools and just absolutely loved your methodology in showing topics to customers to get feedback. How far of a boundary, Samantha, do you think we need to develop when it comes to content creation? Let me explain to you what I'm talking about. We tend to want to talk about our products and our services, but we tend to avoid making life better or tips and advice on life. Where do you think this content marketing revolution is going to take us when it comes to creating engaging, interesting content that makes our life better? How far are we going to go? Are companies going to become publishers of informational content well beyond the scope of our products and services, or do you feel the trend is to stay within your topic and to answer questions related to your topic?
That's a really excellent question, and I think the answer is somewhere in the middle there. I don't believe that it's our job as a business to inform our audience about their life in general, right? I think we're not the experts on that. We should focus our efforts on the domain that's relevant to our topics. Now, having said that, that does not mean talking about our product or service. That means talking about the problems and the opportunities that our product or service addresses. So I do think we need to go broader than we've traditionally thought about, but I don't think we need to swing the pendulum so far that it's unrelated to what we do, because what happens is we then can't convert that audience to purchasing something from us, which is really what we're in our business to do. Now, there are some exceptions to that. If I'm a university, student life, for example, might be very, very important to me, even though I'm not looking to sell them more tuition, right? Or some other types of businesses where I need to offer context for them that is far away from what they do, but it is rare that that's the case. In most cases, I think we need to talk about, write about, speak about, visualize things that relate to our business, but not things that are exclusively about our product or service.
An example
Does
just
that
to
answer
throw
your
at
question?
you, it did, although I have a follow-up from it. So,
Sure.
for example, let's take a life insurance company, or even worse, not worse, but a more challenging topic like a company that makes caskets, right?
Yes.
Why not create animated videos on how to get out of a car if your car has gone into the water, right?
Yeah.
Why not try to take a position on, we want your life to be longer, we want you to avoid catastrophic mistakes or be a survivor and live longer? Is that within, you think, the wheelhouse that's appropriate, and is that in fact where we need to go to try to stand out from the pack?
So I think the answer is, in terms of a life insurance company, it is related to me, right? That is directly, squarely about the relevant service that they provide, which is in this case financial support to your family when you're gone, and trying to eliminate you being gone is an appropriate thing for them to talk about. I wouldn't think in that case that would be appropriate for somebody who sells funeral services or caskets, for example, because they're in a different stage and a different kind of service, and so I think we would use other content topics that would be more dealing with death, dealing with mourning, supporting the people who are left behind, preparing for that so you're not leaving your family with challenges and those types of things. So I think the simple answer is yes, we need to do things that are tangential to what we do and to help people be more successful, but to make sure that it aligns with what our audience, and again, the best way to do this is to ask our audience, does your audience want to hear that from me as their insurance provider? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is I don't trust you to provide that information for me. Even if your intentions and spirits are honest and sincere, you're not the person I'm going to turn to for that kind of content, and that's why doing that qualitative research process is really important, because we can put a lot invested in creating content that doesn't resonate. However, again, the most important thing is, yes, think outside there, write those things down, and then ask your audience if you can be a trusted source for that, and then make the investments where they resonate with you and they align to your goals and theirs at the same time.
A great question from Lisa J here. How do you motivate people, would-be personas, target audience members, to sit still for interviews?
Really good question, and I'll be really honest. 2 ways that I motivate people. One time I pay people, and paying people means sometimes it's a $20 Amazon gift card, sometimes it's taking them out for coffee. They happen to be at a conference anyways, so I can sit down. Sometimes I'm at a lunch table and I'm that obnoxious person saying, chatting with you, and then say, hey, can I get 10 minutes of coffee with you this afternoon? I have a question I'd love to run by you. And you'd be surprised how many people are receptive. I also use charitable donations quite a bit. I find that for professionals in particular, where $20 is a meaningless financial incentive, helping a cause that they care about is something that they get behind. So about 75% of the time I pay, and the other 25% of the time you'd be shocked how much people say yes. But they say yes because we offer constraints. I'm only going to take 15 minutes of your time, right? I've got 3 questions I'm dying to ask you, and be selective about how you're asking and make sure that they're really relevant to the topic. And you'd be, some chocolate and some coffee go a long way.
Thea had a great question too. We left her hanging and everyone hanging on the 3 things that are critical for you to ask to somebody that's sort of pre-flighting something you want to publish.
Oh, sure.
Remember the first one, is this material helpful to you? The second one, what am I missing? Haven't I drilled down deep enough to? And the third, maybe, is there anything confusing? Is that right?
You got it. Yes, and thank you. I know that's where we got cut off a little bit. Those are the 3 questions that I ask. Exactly correct. Is this material helpful for you? What am I missing or haven't gone deep enough? And is there anything confusing?
Another great question from Pat.
Go ahead. Uh-oh, can you hear me?
Sorry about that. Another question from Pat. Do you have a sample editorial calendar template to recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have a specific one that I can recommend, but I'd be happy to, sort of send, if anybody's interested, send me an email. I'll put up the next slide, has my contact information. I can send you something that I use personally. I don't think there's any, magic into the editorial calendar itself. I do find where the magic lies is in the analysis and the reporting, and that's something that is but challenging. But the editorial calendar itself is probably going to look very similar. The key difference, I think, in the one that I use versus what is typically used is I break mine down by audience. A lot of people will break it down by product or service line, so they'll have a very internal view of what that editorial calendar is, and I try and flip that to focus on who is this content for, and I found that to be very helpful in reorienting how we prioritize.
That question also inspires me to list a few templates in the new book, which I'll be doing. And Maria chimes in on this question and suggests do a quick search on templates available on a quick Google search. And I'm sure you found some templates as well. There's lots of interesting templates. On the template structure, do you have a customer journey map template that you have been using, and the same with personas? I saw you had one slide where you showed some persona, at least on the deck that I saw. I'm still gray, by the way, but I had your deck, Samantha, so I was following along with your deck. But my question was regarding personas. You showed a persona with your character up there. You had only questions on the persona, which I thought was very interesting. Is that how you actually present personas? Is that what you're after with the development of personas?
I'm so glad you asked. Not at all. So a persona is actually multi-page content that has several different pieces of content in it, and I'd be more than happy to share follow-up information with that. What I was showing you was what I find is sometimes one of the most important pieces of the persona, which is mapping out the questions that people have along the journey in terms of mapping to my editorial calendar. So the persona itself is going to have a whole bunch more insight in it about motivators and drivers and how they measure success and what's important to them. But I find that that journey map of questions can be very useful and inspiring in prioritizing the editorial calendar, or at least my short-term set of deliverables.
Sue had a question, and she said, in your opinion, how beneficial is the usage of lists in an article, since they do increase size from one page to 2 pages when being asked for, say, a 500-word article? Are you finding lists are important, and how are you deriving those lists, for example, from customers that you might do interviews with? Are you asking people point blank, what sort of format do you like your content delivered in? Are lists, top lists, or informational content irrelevant to you, or do you like more paragraph form? Do you like visual form? Do you like video form? How are you tapping into the wants and needs of customers and readers?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the answer to the list question, I hate when people ask questions, and when I ask a question, people answer, it depends, but in this case, it really does depend on your audience. Lists appeal to certain types of people and not others. How I figure that out is twofold. One is I showed you some tools in the presentation that show what content is being shared and viewed the most. And so I use those tools to look at patterning for my topic, what seems to be resonating with people. So that's one source of input on the format. The other thing that I do is I don't tend to ask people, do you like infographics? Do you like lists? Because you get sort of, sure, I like those kinds of answers. You don't get meaningful things. But I do two things. One is I test the headlines, right? So I test what those would be, and I, list things come across very easily, like 10 things to blah, 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 right? Would that appeal to you? And so I can test for list value there. The other thing I do is I experiment with content formats, and I show it to my audience, and I find out what really resonates with them. So if I'm going to take a topic, I will sort of mock up maybe what an infographic looks like, together what a web seminar could be. I might look up, create a white paper version of it. I might have a blog article. And I'm probably not going to send all of those different assets to somebody and ask them to review them in depth, but I might sort of showcase their portfolio and ask them for their feedback about what they might be interested in. Now, having said all of that, here's what I can tell you. with 100% certainty is that you need variety. There has never been in the history of any audience that I have served or helped my clients serve where a variety of formats was not helpful, because people learn in different ways and they need reinforcement and they need different types of formats. So you can never go wrong by building out variety. I do think that the world is very list-centric because it's a good attention grabber and people tend to download. Lists don't necessarily convert to opportunity well, so if you're going to use lists specifically, just know that you're doing that probably at the early stage of the buying process, and that's probably not going to be very helpful for you once someone is evaluating vendors, for example.
Very interesting. We're towards the end of the presentation now, and we'd like to get a snow update from you. How deep, how many inches have accumulated during this webinar?
I would estimate that it's about another inch, actually. There was a fair amount that came down, and we had that little power blip. Luckily, that didn't last long. So it's coming down out there, and I'm going to get ready to get my gloves and snow boots on and supervise my children shoveling.
As Bill Murray once said in Caddyshack, the heavy stuff is not even coming down yet. So we'll come close to ending on that note, perhaps. And I love the Ferris Bueller. Anyone? Bueller? That's just a brilliant quote.
It's a great movie.
Oh, it's a great tie-in to this presentation. Listen, I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. And Samantha, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It really is fun to talk about this. If the audience has any follow-up questions or we missed anything with that little blip, feel free to email me or anything, and I'd be happy to answer those follow-ups.
You know, it's a good final question. Who would you like to hear from, and how can they get a hold of you, Samantha?
Oh, well, I'm happy to talk to any content marketer, anyone who's struggling with or just, has an ideas around how to do a better job of building out their content strategy, understanding maybe they've been trying some research and don't know how to do it. I've got lots of resources I make freely available to you, and I'm very happy to point you towards information on personas, on building out editorial calendars, on content strategy. I can't wait to read your book, Byron. I'm drooling thinking about it. Like I said, any thought that this presentation inspired for someone, if they have a follow-up thought or idea, please feel free to come to my direction. I love talking about this stuff.
Well, once again, we appreciate you being here and everyone else, particularly in the Northeast, that chimed in. Also, we had a nice guest appearance today, Samantha. Mother Nature made it today on the call.
I love it.
By knocking out your electricity, showing, of course, her genuine interest in your great work here. So,
I'll choose to think of it that way, Byron. Thank you.
A true optimist. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll see you next month on our webinar. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. And thanks, Kel, for being with us today as well to help us get this organized. She's in the background at home working on things. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We'll see you next month.